so there we go. So you want to be on the screen, you got to show your video. So we're going to get started right now, okay? All right, so welcome everyone. It is just 12 days before the election. Historic election. We will decide the future of our country on November 3rd and beyond. And we are really in the sort of closing stretch of this election campaign. I want to welcome all of the WUSA viewers and everyone online to our presidential campaign class here at American University. So we've got some big topics to talk about today, but I want to start off with sort of our top line issue, and that is the upcoming presidential debate, which is going to air this evening. So here, just tossing up a few questions, and oops, hold on, let me get my there we go. Here we go. All right. So, tossing up a few questions, and what do you want these candidates to discuss tonight? What should we expect from them? And in the long run, will this debate mean anything at all? Because that's the big question. Is the vote already baked in? Now, there is one issue that we do know is going to come up tonight. We can expect the president to be able to talk about this and to try and put Joe Biden on the defensive and to make Joe Biden feel uncomfortable, because we all know that Joe Biden gets very uncomfortable when people talk about his family. And that is the Hunter Biden issue and the allegations that were coming from that completely non-verified article in the New York Post handed to them by Rudy Giuliani based on a supposed laptop that was found in Delaware, even though there are reports coming out of Time magazine that these emails had been floating around the marketplace for fake emails in Ukraine for a while, especially when Giuliani was visiting there. The point is that the president really would like the FBI or Attorney General to go after and probe the Bidens to be able to make this an issue. As this Washington Post article said, the president is disappointed that the FBI director in particular, but the Attorney General, have not done what Trump had hoped, indicate that the Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden, his son Hunter Biden, or other Biden associates are under investigation. So the question then becomes, how should Biden respond to that? So let's talk about the debate in general. And anyone want to lead this off? So I see a few people with their hands up. I see Stephanie and Jeff and Maddie B. And why don't you all start us off?
So something I'm interested to see tonight at the debate is the commission's use of muting and how they're finally moving forward with that choice to mute the candidates so they're not talking over one another. I wonder if that's going to perhaps allow us to actually hear what's happening and maybe have some substantive things be said. However, I think it will be interesting because of the mute function and Trump's response to the 60 Minutes interview, how, well, that wasn't related to muting, but he just walked out of it. I could very well see a world where Trump just walks off the stage. If something he's mad about and like can't scream about it, he would just leave. So I don't know. I'm kind of excited to see the entertainment tonight.
I've been thinking about that mute button. The mute button doesn't make him silent in the studio or on stage. He can say whatever he wants under his breath, and if his microphone is muted, all you're going to hear it is a bit of the echo in Joe Biden's microphone. And so potentially it may benefit the person who interrupts, because it doesn't sound like they're interrupting, but it may make the other person on stage uncomfortable because they're constantly hearing no, or criticism, or what about your son, but we're not hearing it on the other end. So imagine if you're sort of listening to this on radio and not even watching it on TV. You won't even know that the other person is talking if there's a split screen. So I'm really curious, like you, how this is going to play out, because whether this is going to actually encourage a bit of back and forth on the stage, and potentially benefit the person who's interrupting, because the mute button will have them silent on their main mic, and therefore it won't seem as egregious if they are interrupting. So maybe I'm thinking through this too much, but that's been going through my mind on some of this stuff. So I think Jeff, Maddie B, and then Robin.
Yeah, I think like everyone else, I'm really excited to see how this mute button plays out, and if we still hear Trump's reverberation through Biden's mic. I think we will. But what I want to see and what I hope we see is, I would like to see Trump answer some questions, and not dodge and avoid. Let's see if he has anything, because so far, if you look at any of his rallies, any of his commercials, really, the previous debate, we're coming back, America's strong. But what have you done? How have you done it? He hasn't sold anything to the American people, it feels like to me. And, this is his chance to make up some ground. Obviously, I don't think many people in this room want him to, but this is his chance. And, this can only help him and it can only hurt Biden. But I also think if I'm Biden with the whole Hunter Biden thing, I don't know that I respond to it, aside from, he's been cleared investigations, and everything. But I think I would have Hunter Biden in the audience, and because Trump's, there's alleged stories of him being a coward, and let's see him say it to the dude's face and have Hunter Biden stare Trump down the entire time. I think that's what I would do, and try to make Trump a little uncomfortable with it.
So let me go back to your first point for a second. Do you think Joe Biden has been better in articulating what he would like to do in his first term?
I don't think he's been particularly great, but I think he's been par for the course with other political candidates and everything. You're getting something out of Joe Biden, and I think if you're paying attention to the campaigns, you have a more clear stance of where Biden stands on most issues, or at least certain issues. But with Trump, it just seems like he doesn't. It seems like he doesn't have anything, and he's using any distraction tactics and smoke and mirrors and production strategy at his disposal to try to make himself look good or discredit the Bidens or something, and
So let me just press you for a second on that, and then we'll go to somebody else. What is wrong with saying that his agenda is he won't raise taxes, he will continue to reduce regulations, he will continue to pursue a trade war or other hostilities with China, and that he will push forth a foreign policy in which it's America first, irrespective of what any allies or other countries might think, that he wants to continue to put conservatives on the Supreme Court, that he wants to pursue what he and his supporters will call religious liberty policies throughout the government. Hasn't he laid out somewhat of a portfolio and a platform for his second term?
I don't think he's laid out the how.
Okay, well, he can always say he's done it.
You could say, I'm going to do an American first agenda, but that's all it seems to be he has on that. What's he going to do? How's he going to do it? And it doesn't seem like there's anything there.
All right, so who's up next? I think it was Maddie B, right?
Yes, that was me. So I think that with this debate, we're going to see this is sort of Trump's final chance to really pull out all the shots and really get those voters back that he's going to need to win the election. And I think that means that Trump is going to go all out in some ways. I don't know how that'll play out exactly. And I think that gets complicated when we look at sort of the muted mics, because we've seen sort of Trump's strategy of constantly interrupting with his perspective, that sort of thing. And so this may be an issue for him going forward. But I think additionally, like you were saying, this could be a bigger issue for Biden. I think with muted mics, not only is there a chance that he's hearing the crosstalk and that distracts him and stuff like that, but with a muted mic, he does have the opportunity to give his whole points, say what he needs to say in those 2 minutes that he'll be given, but he also has the chance to make a flub. And I think that is something to take into consideration, that he's really going to have to be prepared for ignoring whatever Trump's doing and continuing on his path.
So what you're saying is that Biden needs to be very focused, needs to talk as much about issues as you can in those 2 minutes or back and forth, sort of what Jeff just said, that he's doing enough to be able to talk about these things, and that he has to keep focused on not being distracted by what the president is saying. How does he respond to the Hunter Biden thing?
I think that's a good question. I think his take on it in the last debate was actually seemed to go over pretty well. My son is a flawed person. I think that, and I still love him. This sort of growth, this is something that a lot of families go through, focusing on sort of that aspect of Hunter Biden. I think when it comes to China and stuff like that, he now has the ability, as of this morning, to point out Trump's Chinese bank account. And I think that would be a good strategy. Yeah,
the Chinese bank account was a gift of reporting for the Biden campaign. There's one thing that would be really provocative that Biden can do, and I don't know if he would do it, which is to acknowledge what you said just now, that his son has gone through a lot of different issues, and then to look the president in the eye and say, but you understand that, Mr. President, because your brother went through similar issues as well, and we should not hold any of that against you or against your family, and I just think you need to take your foot off the gas pedal on these things and realize that families struggle like every family in America does to be able to maintain the health of its members. I don't know if that would be too provocative, but if I were coaching Joe Biden, I'd say have that in your back pocket if you really feel it's necessary, because as much as Hunter Biden is a raw nerve for Joe Biden, Donald Trump's brother is a raw nerve for him. And if he feels that he needs to provoke the president, maybe that's how I would do it, but I would do it in a very, very sensitive way. I don't know, maybe too provocative, maybe not, but we'll see. So I see some more folks up here. I know Robin was up, and I saw Adriana, Anya, Manuel, Andrea, and Chloe.
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to the mute button for just a second and talk about how embarrassing it is for the American people. I mean, these are the two most powerful men in the country running for the most powerful position in the country and ultimately the world. And we have to mute them like kindergartners in class when a teacher has to separate the two and have quiet games or whatever. It's embarrassing, not only as an American citizen, but people around the world are like, wow, you guys can't even have a presidential debate where you can discuss different policies without having to mute people. And I just think it's absolutely ridiculous. And I hope this does not set a precedent for future debates going forward. But unfortunately, people are obsessed with this idea of these debates now being a spectacle. And I feel like politicians will use this to their advantage, and I am nervous, and I hope that we can move past this because it is a complete embarrassment, and I am nervously waiting to see what's going to happen tonight and then the ramifications in the future.
Yeah, I think that's just a really good point. And when you look internationally, the whole sense of America constantly beating our chests and saying we're the best democracy in the world. And this is what we have to expect from the two people running for arguably the most powerful position in the world, that we have to mute them like children, and that our debates ultimately come out not as exchanges of ideas per se, but as you say, as spectacles, as entertainment, as reality TV, as just one step above that infamous show from the 2000s, The Fear Factor. And so I think you're right. I think we have to sort of step back and have a bit of a reckoning that, do we really feel that our democracy is so strong if we need to have a mute button on the two people running for president of the United States? I think that's a powerful comment. So I know that Chloe's the gatekeeper, so I think it was Adriana was next, right?
Yes, thank you, Chloe. So I think for this debate, I kind of agree with a lot of what people like Jeff have said and Maddie B, that Biden just needs to kind of hold steady. That's all he needs to do to be successful, is just continue with what he's doing. He doesn't need to be exemplary. He doesn't need to be anything spectacular. He just needs to be his regular, kind of boring, self, you know? I think that's what the people really desperately want. And I think if he just does that and lets Trump blow up and portray himself as a kindergartner, and, you know, I wouldn't be surprised, like Stephanie was saying, if he just walked off the stage all frustrated. I kind of thought that too. So I think Biden kind of just has, if he continues that, if he does that and just stays calm and doesn't let anyone provoke him, he will be fine and it won't change anything. But I also wanted to kind of touch on what Jeff was saying about how Trump needs to actually answer questions, and your retort, Professor, about how hasn't he projected like policies and answers and stuff like that. And you gave some examples, and my answer to those examples is those aren't like real policies, those aren't real actions. It's all fluff, you know? Oh, we're going to protect religious freedoms. What does that mean? You know, what does it mean you're going to do? Oh, we're going to make America great. We're going to keep doing what we've been doing. What does that mean? You know, he hasn't projected any new policies, any new courses of action for the second term, which is, we've talked about before, is unusual for an incumbent, but I guess not for Trump. But he hasn't said anything substantial. You know, he, like Biden said, where's his healthcare plan? Where's his plan on anything? It's just it's just all grandeur and fluff about that he talks about. And so I don't think that necessarily hurts him. You know, I think he's gotten this far with that. And I think if he continues with the fluff and grandeur and the questions, I don't think anyone's going to necessarily call him out for it. But Jeff's right in the sense that he doesn't say anything really of substance. It's just Trumpism. And I think when you put him next to Biden, it does become a little, when Biden does answer questions, even as a politician might, you know, a little vague, but still policies and plans, it becomes a little more obvious. And I think that's why Trump partly tries to, you know, throw the debates into his field where it's more of a drama than an actual debate. So I would hope Trump is going to answer some questions. I don't think he will. So I think that means Biden just needs to do what he does best and be boring.
All right, so I'll just go at you just briefly the way I did Jeff. But I will say first, your point about sort of character is important. 6 months ago, I was speaking to the head of elections at CBS News, and I said, you know, this election ultimately may fall on character, or may have been more than 6 months, but because this was before COVID hit. And I do think that is a theme. Who do you want in the Oval Office? Who do you want as your president? Who do you want representing you? What type of behavior do you want out of the White House? I do think that weighs on a lot of people's minds, particularly those archetypal suburban voters who have been the focus of so much you know, copy in the media. But let me just say this, before COVID hit, there were still many problems in our country, but the president would argue that we were doing great, that our economy was humming along, that people were, you know, getting jobs, and because they were getting jobs, they had more of a safety net under themselves. So from his perspective, he's doing everything he can with the Operation Warp Speed to get a vaccine out there, sort of this Manhattan Project on behalf of a vaccine, that his whole point was to cure this thing as quickly as possible so we could get back to the America that we had before COVID, which he will argue, whether accurately or truthfully or not, was a result of his economic policies of cutting taxes and reducing regulations. So isn't there sort of a consistent sense what he's trying to lay out, that he's addressing COVID by getting us over this with a vaccine and doing it in record time, and that he can then go and continue to put in place the policies that he will argue, whether accurately or not, were responsible for this sort of humming economy that we had in early March of 2020.
I mean, his message is consistent with that. You know, he's consistently portraying that. But again, first of all, the only reason he says that America was doing so great was because the economy was, you know, it was great. But we've had so many other issues during Trump's administration that had nothing to do with the economy, like we've lost our soft power absolutely incredibly during his term, but that's a different story. But his narrative that he just needs to get over the coronavirus as quickly as possible so we can get back to the America that he built, you know, with his economic policies is also a very flawed narrative, because we can't just do what we were doing when coronavirus is over. We can't just go back to the way it was. There's going to be a lot of economic rebuilding that needs to happen. There's going to be a lot of stimulus that needs to happen. There's going to be a lot of reform that needs to happen, both in the government with like economic policies and maybe voting policies, but also, you know, after the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going to need to see a lot of racial reform. And so we can't just go back to how it was. So I know it appeals to his base, this talk that we're just going to go back to the way it was, because we've all been so thrown out of our loop, thrown out of our heads, that we kind of just want it to be back to the ways. We want to go back to normal, but we can't. And I don't even know if Trump truly realizes that, maybe. But when coronavirus is over, whether that's because Trump creates a miracle vaccine or just peters out in 3 years or whatever happens, it's not going to be just COVID is over, here's a solid end date, and now we're back to the way things were. It's going to be a lot of rebuilding. And he hasn't even given a plan for how he's going to do that. He hasn't given a plan for how he hasn't even talked about specific economic plans he's going to institute to help rebuild the country. He just says, we're going to go back to my economic plans, which are great because I'm great. So again, his message is consistent and it appeals to his base. I'm not arguing that he's necessarily doing anything to turn people off, but it's, again, fluff and no substance, like cotton candy, you know? So I don't think he's really vocalized anything important.
And I do think
Can
a lot.
I throw something out?
Sure.
I like everything that's been said here. I want to go back to what you said, though, about character. And a lot of things come under character. I still say this election, you know, is a referendum on Donald Trump, okay? I think he's got to try and look presidential tonight. If they use that mute button a lot on him, he's in trouble, because the story of the next day is going to be how many times was he muted, how many times, you know, was Biden muted. In terms of Hunter Biden, I think Joe Biden just has to stay away from that as much as possible. Hit it, dismiss it, move on. And in that regard, the moderator is going to be really important. Joe Biden, you know, won't feel compelled to answer Donald Trump's questions, but he'll have to answer the moderator's question. So it depends if the moderator is going to let him off on that. You know, the other thing, when we talk about COVID-19, everybody agrees, you know, that's, you know, the coronavirus is the number one issue. It's the coronavirus, but it's also how a president behaves in a crisis. And this is no doubt his, by far, biggest crisis. It would be the biggest crisis for any president. And if you look at how he's handled this and ask yourself, well, what if this had been a war? Do you really want Donald Trump in charge if we have to go to war? If he's got his finger on, you know, the button, that sort of thing. And I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just trying to be honest about this and what I'm hearing from a lot of people, including Republicans that voted for Donald Trump. And it was fairly easy for them to vote for Donald Trump when he's running against Hillary Clinton. This is different. They have had 4 years to look at this president, and they've seen him in the throes of this big crisis. And he gets failing grades, you know, on all levels with this crisis. You know, a thing came out, today, yesterday, late yesterday, about the number of years we've lost in terms of lives lost to coronavirus. It's astronomical. This did not have to happen. And the people that come out and try to defend the president, they don't have a lot of credibility here. So number one, I think the president has to try and show that he's not the what he said in the past, because a lot of that has been built on lies and deception and that sort of thing. And I think if he goes down that road of just attacking Joe Biden with his family and his son and blah, 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 that's more of the same. And I just think that's a major turnoff for a lot of the voters that he really needs, because he's got to get way beyond his base if he's going to get back into this race.
So 2 quick points on that, and I think you and Adriana are saying something very similar, which is that the president has failed to address this crisis in an effective manner, or even lay out a vision of how our country deals with all of the inequities and problems that this crisis has laid bare, and doesn't have an agenda. So that's what Adriana was saying, it's what Jeff was saying, and that this really is the major issue here, and it does speak to his character and his leadership and his policies and everything along the way. And that is what has become very evident to a lot of voters. But the question about Hunter Biden is interesting because you may be right. But on the other hand, I think what the president would like to do is to throw Joe Biden so off balance that Joe Biden makes a big gaffe, and that becomes the story of this debate. Because the only way that the president is going to cast some doubt on Joe Biden is if there comes a moment in this debate where Joe Biden stumbles or says something wrong or incoherent or commits a gaffe or anything like that, that all of a sudden that becomes the center of attention, and people now focus on that narrative that the Trump campaign and others have tried to put on Joe Biden. Because I think the only way that Donald Trump rises up from this debate is to see Joe Biden fall down. Because I'm not altogether sure that he will articulate a plan and an agenda, which is exactly what Jeff and Andriana were saying. So I sort of agree with you, Bruce, that it doesn't help him beyond his base, except if it makes Joe Biden stumble or get defensive or say something that's wrong. And I think that's the risk that Biden has, which is he has to keep himself under control and not take the bait. So I think Anya was next, and then I'm going to trust Chloe to keep us straight.
I was going to talk about something a little bit different about tonight's debate. I was very eager, well, am very eager to hear about national security. I know that's a topic that's going to be discussed tonight, especially with Russia and Iran, given the recent news that the two countries have obtained voter registration, which could be considered the first kind of concrete piece of evidence of the intention to influence the election, even though the information was mostly public, but still. Coupled with the whole Biden scandal, I think it's very interesting to see how candidates talk about Russia and the future of U.S.-Russia relations. Also to see if they address that Iran is sort of building off Russian methods to show that it too is able to be a force in the election. And then I saw something that John Radcliffe said that was interesting. He said that all of this is just another attempt to undermine people's confidence in American democracy, which made me think that the threat to American democracy, I don't think it stems from some external force, no matter how much people try to blame election outcomes on Russia, China, Iran, whoever. The threat to democracy does come from within the country, with the corruption, with the two-party duality, with the 0.5% of the country being responsible for funding, basically choosing our two main candidates. And these last-minute attempts to sort of turn the attention to other countries, to me, seem like very clear methods to blame the mess that's happening in this country on others, because it is embarrassing what's happening in this country, especially this election. At the end of the day, I think that Russia didn't choose these two candidates. American dollars did, after all, and now the country is suffering the consequences of either candidate becoming the president. I'm just interested to see how they navigate these questions and national security tonight. I think it's quite an interesting topic.
There's an old saying in politics that negative ads only work if there's a kernel of truth to what's being attacked. And so if there's that kernel of truth, the negative ads magnify it and get in people's heads. And that's probably the role that Russia and potentially Iran and even possibly China can play, which is to find those little pinholes and to exploit them and to do things with them. So what you're saying is that the problem is within, even if external actors magnify and make it worse and all the rest. But I do think it's an absolutely legitimate issue, is America's role in the world, how we deal with potentially hostile foreign countries that do have an interest in disrupting democracy. I think it would be shameful if we didn't spend time tonight addressing that, because as a friend of mine from Canada said, the President of the United States isn't just the President of the United States. That President influences my country, influences every other country around the world, and trust me, people everywhere are going to be interested in how they navigate the questions that you're posing here. I think it was Manuel was next, was that correct?
Yeah, I just want to start off by saying that if Joe Biden doesn't rebuke the Hunter narrative with how Donald Trump's kids continue to make multi-million-dollar deals overseas, he has to just come out and say, you want to talk about nepotism? Let's talk about nepotism. Let's talk about how you're still the president of Trump, and Eric is out there doing dealings with this country and this country. You want to talk about foreign interference? Let's talk about foreign interference. The fact that he hasn't done that yet, the fact that he hasn't used even Ben Sass's comments of how the Trump family has treated the presidency as a business seems like political malpractice to me, and I really think they're missing an opportunity to do that. But on the other side, like, if you do that, then you are giving more air to the fire, and like the Hunter thing is going to catch on, but like he always has that. Now, as going back to the mute button, I think we have to remember that Biden didn't really put on a good or memorable performance in the first debate. I just think that Donald Trump performed so poorly that he came out on top. Now you have the mute button, and now Trump has been cornered into a position where he has to actually prep for a debate rather than prep for a rally, because that's how he's prepped for all of his debates. He preps for his debates like he preps for a rally. Sound bites, this, that, interrupt them. Now he's actually going to have to deliver substance. In theory, like he might not, he might still find a way to make this whole debate a Trump fiasco like he usually does. But as for like what topics come up, we know that Trump is going to say like how he's appointed more conservative judges in his first term than any other president. He's going to talk about how Biden wants to pack the court. He's going to talk about Hunter. He's going to talk about fracking. We know all of that, but I want to see how Trump's diagnosis plays into the debate, because I think that the Biden camp has now gotten into a point where they're comfortable using his diagnosis against Donald Trump. They've just started pushing a message. Obama said it yesterday, and it was like, he couldn't even protect himself from the virus. How do you expect him to protect the entire nation? And I really think we're going to see some of that in the debate. And I just think people really miss having a boring president. I think people miss waking up and not having to worry about the president of the United States. Like, maybe we thought about Obama like every other week or so. Now we're just waking up with Donald Trump all over our feeds. And I think people miss a boring president. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in the debate. There is an entire section just on leadership. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the last section. So that really is a gift to Biden, because that's his entire narrative. Forget the economy, forget this, forget that. He is going to be the leader. He's going to be the man of character. And the fact that that's the last section, the fact that that's the section that viewers are going to like go off on, like the last thing they're going to see, I think could really help Biden.
So, footnote to what Manuel says. What about the Chinese bank account? I heard a line today on somebody's cable channel that the president may have paid more taxes to China than he did to the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't personal taxes, it was from the business bank account, but yes, exactly. He paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes to China. I think, you know, it's a risk for Biden to go after Trump's kids. It's a risk, and we'll have to see if he's willing to take that risk, but it's definitely a risk because it may then seem petty. You know, and it may sort of bring Biden down to a level that he may not want to be at. So we'll have to see where that goes, and if he's willing to take that bait again. But I do think the president is going to want to bait him. In terms of a boring president, you know, it may well be that people want an exciting president who's not necessarily provocative or keeping people on edge. But keep this in mind, and this is a matter of perspective for everyone. For certain segments of the Republican Party, Barack Obama every day was a provocation. Bill Clinton every day was a provocation. And for them, those were not boring presidencies. Those are presidencies that provoked them on a daily basis because they felt that every single thing that Barack Obama was doing or Bill Clinton was doing was actually putting them on edge all the time. So again, I'm not discounting what you say here because Donald Trump is an unusual president. No other president before, and I'm not sure anyone after, will tweet the way he's done in the manner that he's done it, which means that you wake up every day greeted by tweets and you don't know what to expect or what he's going to say. But there are plenty of people who may feel that the president is exciting, but exactly what they want. as a president. And my hunch is that you have maybe 35 to 40% of the American people who may feel that way about President Trump. Whether that's enough to get him reelected is a whole different question. Okay, so I think, was it Andrea was next? And then I think it was Chloe, is that correct? And then we have more people on the list coming up. All right, so let's get to Andrea, Chloe, and then I'll see who's next.
I wanted to, and you just re-brought it up, so perfect segue into talking about Biden attacking Trump for his family, whether it's his son or his brother. And quite honestly, I don't think that that Biden will do something like that. I think that Biden cares far too much about his own family to do something such as attack him for his attack Trump for Trump's family. Also, the backlash that Trump received for doing that, especially on Facebook, where a lot of the Trump are, was just, the amount was just uncountable. Like, there was just so much about people saying, that it was really wrong of Trump to attack Biden for such a soft spot. He knows he loves his family, especially his kids, especially Beau. And there was just he faced a lot of backlash on social media for that. And I don't think that, Biden, I think, understands that. And so I don't think that there is a chance that Biden would do it, because he both knows that he could face backlash, but also it's such a sensitive topic for him. So I think he's more humane than to put Trump in a similar position. And I hope and expect him to actually just use policy and use, as someone had been mentioning, as Jeff and Adriana had been mentioning, about Trump has not enough that he's talking about and wants to implement for his second term if he so gets there. But and whereas Biden has more of this foundation to talk about what he wants to do if he were to get elected. So I'm really hoping and expecting to see Biden capitalize on those points and on those moments, and on helping and on actually helping and doing something productive for the American people, instead of continuing to leave us in this limbo of, we don't know what is going on in our country because everything is kind of just falling apart. And I think that is where Biden needs to really step in and take charge and blame him. He needs to be blamed, and he needs to start taking accountability for his actions. And I think that Biden should pressure him to take accountability for said actions.
And I think Biden actually did some of that and did a pretty decent job, and I think that's why he was fairly well reviewed for that ABC town hall that he did last week, doing something like that. But I'm enjoying playing devil's advocate today, so I'm going to toss this one to you, Andrea. Let's say the president said, look, let's talk about kids. My kids had legitimate businesses that involved stuff that was overseas. I take responsibility for it. They did it. That's fine. You can criticize that all you want, but they were legitimate businesses. But your son peddled influence. You had him come on Air Force Two to China, where he was going to try and meet with people to create a deal. He went to Burisma, and what was his credential beyond being the son of a sitting vice president to be able to sit on this board and gain this certain income? This is influence peddling. This is something we don't want in the White House. Criticize my family all you want for their legitimate businesses, but your family was the one that was peddling influence, and do the American people really want that type of culture sitting in the White House? So tell me, beyond the fact that he might not say it that way, would that be a legitimate critique for the president to hit Joe Biden with?
I think it might be a legitimate critique. Whether or not I think he's smart enough to make that critique, no. I don't think that he has the mental capacity to even think of that and to say that. And I also would hope that Biden would be quick-witted enough to mention that while they might have been legitimate businesses, they were not successful businesses per se in the long run. And also to, in the case, if he brings up China, for example, bring up the Chinese bank account. Bring up the fact that it was Trump who used Russian intelligence to rig the elections, essentially, and that he is an impeached president. Let's not forget the fact that he has been impeached. And just because he's still in office does not take away the fact that he had been impeached. And so whether or not I think it's a legitimate possibility, absolutely. I don't think that Trump has enough going on in his mind to come up with something as eloquent as what you said, honestly, pretty fortunately. And I think that Biden is strategic enough to have enough comebacks as to, well, there are also similar things, if not worse things, that you have mapped out.
It's just harder, isn't it? When you phrase it like that, it's harder. So who is next? I think Chloe, right?
Yeah, kind of a completely different turn. I wanted to talk about the moderator. I know we talked about the mute button and the mute function, but I was doing some research about the moderator because I think the third person on a stage is just as important as the two candidates. And there's been obviously a lot of criticism from the president, not necessarily his staff or even his team, but specifically from the president on the fact that she's going to be biased. And I think this is something that, no offense, Bruce, but the press has done, and no offense to me also, is that in fear of being called biased by the president, they have decided to go soft on him. And I don't remember who said this, but I know someone wanted him, I think it was everyone actually, wanted the moderator to ask him about actual policy and him on those questions. And I think everyone wants the president to be pushed in those debates. And I don't necessarily see that happening because of that fear of being called biased and that fear of losing whatever else, any opportunities that might come up from that. I do think that this being the final debate might change that. And I think the moderator is such an excellent reporter and has that skill set and is so respected that that might change that fact. But for now, I just don't see that happening.
So it's the old phrase, working the refs. And I think the president has been working the refs, as effectively as he can. But from the moderator perspective, I mean, look, I'm in a classroom constantly, and I have to think on my toes, and I have to know all of these issues back and forth. I would hope that she doesn't necessarily come in with prepared questions, that she listens to what each of these candidates says, knows enough about the issues to be able to stick it to each of them for the types of specifics and force them to articulate those policies or plans or ideas or perspectives that will give us a sense not of their canned answers, but of the judgments and responses that they make at that particular moment in time, which tells us a lot about how they think, and what their values are and all the rest. So, yeah, I always worry about the moderators over-preparing questions, but under-preparing spontaneity. And if it were up to me, I would want to see them doing a lot more of the latter than so much of the former. So
I totally agree. I think both candidates need to be challenged. Get out of your playbook, or know when to toss that playbook aside and mix it up and hold these people accountable. I absolutely agree with that.
All right, so we got a number of people here. I've seen Zach, I'm going to write everyone down, but Chloe, you're the gatekeeper. Chanel, Maddie M. Who else was up there? Dan, and I think Maddie B, you had your hand up, right? Oh, Christina? All right, so wait, Dan. And I think Maddie B was up there, but I think we've lost her screen. So kick it off, Zach.
So I think that this debate, you'll see like three major moments that will either make or break the final argument for both candidates. I think that the first one is the economy for sure. I think that everyone's still kind of trying to understand what exactly Donald Trump means when he proposes America First policies, because as we've seen, the impact is that America has actually ended up not being first. And so I think that that will be one major talking point, especially because the Build Back Better plan has become a central part of Joe Biden's messaging and campaigning as we're getting closer to the election. And then the second, I think, will be criminal justice reform and race relations. I think that while, of course, there will be moments where the moderator will, I don't know if they will challenge, they will press Trump on his behavior, his rhetoric, the things that he's done in the past. I think it'll also, if this is the moderator who was chosen, I'm hoping that we'll see Joe Biden pressed and challenged a little more and really have to press through this issue, because even in Wisconsin with Breonna Taylor's murder, I just think that all the things going on with her case and all the mishandling of it, a lot of people are still looking to the people who are complicit in the institutions that allowed a lot of the things, the chaos that has come out of it. I think that that is what's going to really be a talking point for Joe Biden in tonight's debate, because so many people will be looking for an answer. And then the last moment is kind of something that I think that Democrats will honestly lose out on if they don't, which is pointing out Trump's weakness in his own final argument, which is the conversation has gone exactly back to where it was around this time in October in 2016, which is basically emails again. And I think that for especially lower information voters who are looking to understand what's really at stake, that is going to be a key issue that people will see from 2016 and be like, wait, hold up, are we in a time warp? What is going on? So I'm hoping that right there, Democrats will take the chance to say, Donald Trump really is on his last leg here, to the point where he's making the same argument that he did in 2016, just in a different way with a different candidate. And so if this doesn't become, I think, sort of one of the main things that Democrats take away from where Donald Trump is with his campaign, then that will be a huge moment lost. But I'm hoping that tonight in the debate, that will maybe actually be a point of contention that will allow people to really engage with what's to come for these next 2 weeks.
So quick question, Zach. You're saying that in 2016, the email issue was on Hillary Clinton's shoulders, and now you think it needs to be on Donald Trump's shoulders because of the dubious genesis of these so-called Hunter Biden emails and how they were floating around Ukraine. And isn't he complicit with, so let's say, Russian agents or foreign agents in trying to undermine our election, and then trying to use the FBI and the Department of Justice to go after a political opponent? Is that how you see it coming out? Yeah.
Exactly, actually, and I think that strategists need to see on the side that it was effective enough in 2016 to literally make Hillary Clinton go down in the polls so quick to the election. That hopefully this particular, this election here, I think that it just needs to become that we won't let the same thing happen. And so if that's not what Democrats are thinking right now, then I think that they're missing a huge moment to really bring everyone together and say, look what the president is doing in order to try and get reelected. He's using his same old, just thrown out playbook that nobody's really responding to anymore.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point, and it may well be that Joe Biden doesn't play defense on this, he plays offense on this, and that may be an interesting way to approach it, which is, we know this stuff is bunk. We know this stuff is garbage. We know that Rudy Giuliani has been floating around Ukraine, meeting with Russian disinformation agents trying to get this stuff. What type of government are you running, and really stick it to them, almost take it and not defend, but push it on President Trump. I do think the race issue is potentially more difficult for Joe Biden than it is for Donald Trump. Donald Trump will say we had the best black unemployment numbers and Latino unemployment numbers before COVID. The economy was doing great. We had criminal justice. I believe in the police. The police have to do their job, and they want to protect minority communities as well. He'll say that, and that will appeal to his base of voters and to a lot of people but we'll listen to that. Joe Biden has to, has a much broader coalition that he's going to somehow have to satisfy on that particular issue. And it'll be interesting to see how he walks that balance beam in answering the notion that, yes, he supports the police, but as he said, there are bad apples in the police, that, we believe in sort of good policing with justice, but we also have to address the incredible inequities that riddle our system economically in terms of law enforcement and institutionally in our country. So he has to be able to articulate that in a way that speaks to his broader coalition that he has right now, because it's that coalition that he needs to hold together to be able to make a difference in these battleground states, because it doesn't matter what people in DC or New York or California think. It's what somebody in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, or Arizona thinks. And that's where he has to be able to figure out how to say it. I do think he did a fairly good job in the town hall last week and admitting some of the issues with the 1994 crime bill, but I think he needs to be sharper and better on it tonight. I think it was Chanel was next.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something that I found mildly alarming in the fact that it wasn't addressed in the first debate. I don't believe it was addressed in the vice presidential debate, and I don't think it's being addressed tonight. And that's the whole topic around immigration and immigration reform and rights. And I think especially because I don't know if people assume that has been handled, but there's allegedly 20 plus women at the border who have had forced hysterectomies. There's 545 migrant children who now can't find their parents because of Trump's policies that have been enacted. And just a few months ago, we saw Trump trying to enforce the F1 visa rollback on international students. So there's a lot at stake in terms of what's on the table here. And it's just interesting to see how this topic really has not been covered that much at all. If you look back 4 years ago, it seemed like immigration kind of took priority, and maybe that was because of Trump's rhetoric around the border and just around immigrants in general. But this is something that really has not come up, and I think it's interesting to see if it does. I think it's important that it does, but I found that it has been alarming that there has really been zero conversation on both ends about what they're going to do moving forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's absolutely startling that this is a huge issue of the entire Trump campaign in 2016 and his presidency, and it's like we have national amnesia. This isn't even part of the conversation. It's not even coming up when it ought to be central, because it's a big part of his policies. Remember, just 2 years ago, what was the president talking about? The caravan of people trying to come in here and invade America. This was just 2 years ago. Now, it could be that they knew that didn't work and that didn't resonate with voters, and it may have actually pushed away some of those suburban voters. But the president does talk about it a little bit at his rallies, but shame on the press. Shame on the press for not bringing that up and, getting Joe Biden to talk about that issue and getting Donald Trump to defend his record. I agree with you. That's sort of like a startling amnesia nationwide. Maddie M.
I just have a general frustration over the fact that so much time and energy is being spent talking about Hunter Biden at all. I mean, the American people have heard more about the Biden family than they have about their own family. I mean, you have all of these Trump and Biden ads on both ends that are talking about they care for the American people, they're here for the American people, it's the American people first. But Trump is spending so much time talking about the family of Hunter Biden when so many American families are being alienated from the conversation because they're not even in the conversation. And he's spending so much more time, to Chloe's point, alienating the moderator for tonight. Bill Stipend is releasing statements about the commission on the debate saying that it's unfair that they're not talking about foreign affairs and immigration. Well, if they want to talk about that, they should steer the conversation that way instead of wasting their time talking about Hunter Biden at all. Yes, it does highlight the distrust that so many Americans have about our political system, but it isn't anything new that we've learned. There is distrust over our system. It doesn't have to take a member of the Biden family to remind us of that.
Yeah, so there's the potential Biden soundbite from the debate, which is, you spent so much of your presidency, and in fact, you were impeached because you're obsessed over my family, but look at where the American families are right now, or something along those lines. I think that's exactly the soundbite that Joe Biden can use to be able to push back and to keep it focused not on these little issues that people are raising that arguably are even not truthful, but on the consequences of a presidential election in our daily lives and how we lead our lives amid a pandemic and an economic crisis. So I think, if the Biden people are watching, you've just given them one of Joe Biden's sound bites for the evening. I think it was Dan.
I was actually going to say something really similar to Maddie, specifically because why play Trump's game? Why give him that attention? Why allow him to control the narrative? Because that's exactly what he's doing. He's casting doubt, he's gaslighting, and that's what he's great at. Earlier this summer, I was one of the people that signed up for the one of his rallies. What was it going? Like through the TikTok campaign, right? And a part of that was subscribing to texts. And blatantly, I don't think I've ever been gaslighted so heavily through texts. I felt like I was being harassed. The way things were worded, the punctuation, the grammar, I was in shock because it doesn't seem, when the campaign would text you, it didn't seem, you wouldn't guess it was a presidential candidate. No, you'd expect it to be an abusive partner. It was really shocking. Then also I wanted to say that I think that during the VP debate, something that really spoke to me and that really affected me personally was when Senator Harris spoke to our generation and talked about how the Trump campaign is going to roll back our insurance and how that was an issue. And she spoke not just about it, she spoke directly to us. And I think Biden, now that he'll have the chance to speak, hopefully tonight, in full sentences, he should absolutely do that. He should speak to the American people. He should get the chance to be able to connect with people, because I know when Senator Harris did that, she connected with me, and that made me care about it. One last thing I think that would be a really interesting topic, because both candidates they flaw on different levels about it, but both candidates have flaws on it, is the trans community. I think that if, for example, they talk about, or the moderator asked a question about how the Trump administration has rolled back trans rights, how they have created and tried to institutionally legalize the discrimination of the trans community, how even Tiffany Trump the other day, when she was at an LGBTQ without the T, was the Trump campaign has now been removing the trans community from their entire LGBTQ, I do quotes because they're not involved in their campaign. And I just think that it's underlooked because the trans community is underlooked. And I think that people with a heart, people with a brain will realize that this is wrong. That, people shouldn't be denied medical treatment because they're transgender. And then back on that, it could also hurt Biden, though, because I know during his town hall, while he did discuss the important amount of Black trans women that are disproportionately murdered, which is a very real, very big issue, he started off the sentence with those who choose to be transgender, which is not a choice. So he kind of dropped the ball on that. But I think that, say, if Biden was apologized at the debate and said, I was wrong, I need to learn more, I'm constantly learning, and I'm trying to sympathize with the community, he could gain a lot of traction. And I think that also goes back to the point of not playing Trump's game. Trump is a king of gaslighting. He will gaslight about Hunter Biden. And it's just upsetting because we're now talking about Hunter Biden essentially giving light to that issue, when who on this Zoom call actually cares about Hunter Biden? Who cares about Hunter Biden when there's COVID-19? There's insane inequity across our country. So it's just...
So the only reason we have to care is it'll come up, and how it's processed and responded to. But I do think your point about the trans community is relevant to the Biden message, which is to restore a sense of community to America, that every American's life is of value, of importance, and we have to treat everybody with respect and dignity. And that's the way that he can frame it consistent with the message that he's been communicating. We saw in class yesterday some of his, closing arguments and how that gets reflected in some of his ads. And I think if he keeps it focused on that, that will be a message that will at least resonate with a great many Americans, because people don't want to have a divided America, even if they are partisan. They would rather have an America that at least speaks to a larger sense of community, at least in theory, if not in practice. So I do think that would be very consistent with the messaging that he's been communicating. I think Christina was next, and then Maddie B.
So I just wanted to talk about if these debates are actually going to matter and will it change anything. Truthfully, I don't think this debate will change people's minds. There's only about 1 to 5% of voters who say that they're undecided, whereas in 2016, the numbers were about 4 to 9% who were undecided. And unlike 2016, this election has fewer voters who will consider third-party candidates. There's, for example, Kanye West. He barely got enough support or votes to even register on a lot of states' ballots. So I don't think a lot of people have already made up their minds. 26 million people have already voted, casted their ballots in the mail. So honestly, I think this debate, all it will do is feed into the echo chamber that is social media, and it'll just provide entertainment for us, if anything. I think most people will just be tuning in to see how their candidate does and how, they rebuttal against the other. So truthfully, I don't think this debate will change anybody's minds. Most people are already made up, or they're just sick of politics in general at this point.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. There's that old phrase, first do no harm, and I think that should apply to the Biden campaign in particular, given the polls. So the president can score a few points. The only caveat I would add to what you were saying, Christina, is that some of those battleground states, the numbers are so thin in terms of the margins that even 3 or 4 or 5% could make a difference in those states. So I think that's the sort of small ball game that President Trump is playing right now, which is to look at those particular battleground states and to be able to say, how can I keep those regardless of what the margin is, and how do I score points? Because the narrative tonight that all the press is putting out there, you look at all of the front pages of the papers and everything, this is the president's last chance, or this is his last chance to bring people to his side. Now, nationwide, I agree with you. The question is whether it might make a difference, let's say in Pennsylvania, or North Carolina, or Arizona, or Florida, and all the rest. So that's where it gets sort of interesting, because 1 to 5% of the vote is 5% of the vote is about 7.5 million people. 1% may be about 1.5 million people. Given that Michigan went by 11,000 in 2016, that 1.5 million spread around some of these battleground states could make a difference. So I agree with you in general, but I do think that there is that chance for him to be able to make a difference, or there may be a stumble by Joe Biden that could make a difference. And I think there's more of a risk of that taking place than the president persuading people to come to his side. So that's why I think he will be bringing up the Hunter Biden thing, is to try to make Joe Biden stumble and create a mishap. So I think that's what they're thinking right now strategically. Whether it's all baked in, I don't know. It could be, as you say, but those margins are so thin potentially that that's what they're thinking. Maddie B?
Yeah, this is jumping back a bit. I just wanted to say one last thing, sort of about the muting of the mics. I think I, myself included, we've talked a lot about how the muted mics could disrupt Trump's strategy. But I think one thing we also have to keep in mind is that Trump, as we've talked about, is extremely media savvy. And I think he probably saw last debate that the constant interruption didn't work for him. And so maybe since then has been working on a strategy to flip around and to make something new work for him. So I think that it may not be as big a hindrance as we consider it, and it may be his upset persona about this may be more of just a way to attack the media further rather than something that truly disrupts what he plans to do.
Yeah, again, don't discount the fact that Donald Trump did a reality TV show for years and knows producers who understand how to react and respond on stage to things and to be able to pivot and make adjustments and all the rest. So it's not like he's doing this all alone. He's got people speaking into his ear also saying, this is how you do it, this is how you need to be able to portray yourself, this is how you need to be able to keep Joe Biden off balance. I think what he tried to do the last time was to keep interrupting Joe Biden, because there is some evidence that if you keep interrupting somebody who in their life had a stuttering problem, they will default to some problems as they're speaking and start stumbling over their words. I think they misplayed that completely if that's what they were thinking. But again, they have to now rethink how they do that. But remember, in years past, as I've mentioned, I know I have some evidence, it's secondhand, that sort of George W. Bush, brought in a psychologist to study Al Gore and to how to make Al Gore seem really upset on the stage in the year 2000 with things that Bush was saying. And whether it worked or not, we do know that Al Gore won on substance in the first debate, but lost because of his size, his rolling of the eyes, and his seeming disgust with what George W. Bush was saying, and everyone focused on that afterwards. So you're constantly gaming out this, as I always say, three-dimensional chess game of psychology, of optics, of cameras, of statements, of content, of substance, of sound bites, to be able to figure out how to capture the media narrative afterwards. And that's what this game is all about, is capturing the media narrative afterwards and what people say about it, because people will be swayed afterwards if they think everybody else thought that Donald Trump did a great job or Donald Trump did a terrible job. It just has an influence on all of this, and this is how you're thinking this stuff out. All right, so I do want to get on to a potentially bigger topic right now, because some of you have touched on this, and it relates to the health of our democracy, because I think in many ways we are at this sort of turning point where if we don't sort of recapture some of the institutions and some of the conversations in our democracy, we could be in for a lot of trouble down the line. So I'm going to put this up and sort of see what you all think here. So, all right, so let's get rid of this screen. All right, so these are three of the things that I want to talk about up front, and I'm going to show you some evidence on that. The disinformation, misinformation, all the bots and social media activity, the conspiracies which feed off of that social media disinformation culture, and associated with that, almost the crowdsourcing of just about everything in our society, in which we increasingly distrust the experts in the science, which we are seeing today with the objections to masks and resentment toward certain expertise and scientists in the COVID crisis. I also want to hopefully have time to get to the issue of voter suppression and intimidation, and then to the election chaos that we may be facing. All right. So it just startled me that it was only about a week or so ago that Facebook banned Holocaust denial on their site. And as the subheader said, critics ask what took them so long. But it's not just Holocaust denial, which should have been a low-hanging fruit. It's just about everything that goes on in the Facebook community, and which allowed the Russians or other hostile foreign powers to be able to make inroads in the year 2016, to be able to do what they wanted, post what they wanted, and trust me, you put up one block and people are going to find a way to get around it. Here is an NBC story on the Facebook, the information that's being just sort of spread virally on social media.
From the wrong election date on Twitter to fake robocalls.
If you vote by mail, your personal information will be part of a public database.
Experts are now sounding the alarm about digital disinformation aimed squarely at Black and Latino voters. Since January, almost a quarter of the 13 million mentions of vote by mail on social media included misinformation.
Think about that. A quarter of the 13 million of vote by mail on social media had misinformation. And then there's this.
So we put them to the test using social media posts we found online.
So you all have cards here, and I need you to tell me whether you believe these memes are real or false. Vote by mail, boost black turnout. Real or fake?
Probably in general. No, it's like black folks despise vote by mail.
Real, fake. The answer is real. Voter turnout has been higher this year according to preliminary data. This is a tweet. Doing my part and voting early. DM me for convenient locations to drop your ballot off. Okay, hold them up for me. Real, fake. The answer is fake. That black ballot box is not a real ballot box. This is a tweet. It says by Caleb Littleford Blacks for Trump. Leaving the Democratic Party has been on my mind for a few weeks now. Is there room on the Trump train? Is this a real tweet? Real or fake? That gentleman is actually a singer, and his image has just been reposted to use for that tweet.
By a Russian bot.
Yep. Have you seen things like this in your social media feeds?
Yes. I'm their prime target. I'm an Afro-Latino. So they send me both.
It's laughable if it weren't scary.
Laughable if it weren't scary. Here with the Hunter Biden thing, the FBI is probing, whether it's tied to Russian disinformation, but Rudy Giuliani, I think it was yesterday or the day before, North Dakota Talk Radio said they, meaning the media, set up an iron curtain so you can't get out the New York Post story, which I happen to know is 100% accurate. And then he said, but even if it isn't accurate, the American people are entitled to know it. Think about that. Even if it isn't accurate, the American people are entitled to know it, which is an utterly startling remark, but it's reflective of a culture on social media that even if something isn't accurate, people should know about it. But who knows what's accurate and what isn't if you don't have fact-checking 24/7 to be able to help you know whether something is accurate or not. That sentence to me says a whole lot. Just going to go on with, touch on some of the conspiracy thing. QAnon, linked to at least 44 election candidates in 2020, and some could win. In fact, some will win. Here's a QAnon candidate from California. This is reflective of what he is thinking and others in QAnon think.
Feel now, very strongly, that Q has become sort of a line in the sand, that if you are against Q, then you are either actively or passively supporting human trafficking and child trafficking.
You might notice the red, white, and blue banner behind Mike Carlisle. He's the Republican nominee for Congress in the heavily Democratic district east of Los Angeles.
I want to name some people and tell me whether you think, or whether Q has said they are involved in this human trafficking. Hillary Clinton?
Yes.
Barack Obama?
Yes.
George Soros?
Yes.
Michelle Obama?
This I don't know.
Bill Gates?
Yes.
Nancy Pelosi?
This I don't know.
Huma Abedin?
No, let me back up. I think I did hear something about Nancy and Uma. But here's the thing, the names you've named have all had allegations of doing things wrong. Where's the investigation?
Turns out, when you talk to a Q believer, every question just begets more questions. Like when I asked about some of the more outlandish Q beliefs regarding President Obama.
How does one investigate whether Barack Obama worships Satan or drinks blood?
Well, I would start by putting him in front of a panel of people and asking him, has anybody asked him, sir, have you engaged in these activities?
Okay, and here is a leading QAnon activist speaking to CBS this morning.
Dustin Nemos is a part of the QAnon community, and it's also how he makes a living.
This is Dustin Nemos of the Nemos News Network.
Nemos posts on his YouTube channel several times a week, sometimes several times a day,
Should we talk a little bit about COVID
and considers himself a seeker of truth in a fake news world.
COVID is the biggest lie fake news has ever told.
How can you say that when you look at the numbers?
Well, I don't trust the numbers, first of all. In New York, they supposedly had hashtag warzone hospitals. I had friends and audience members going out there with their cell phones saying it's a ghost town, no one's here.
You're talking to someone who is in New York. You're talking to a crew of folks who experienced a lot of this firsthand.
Well, why were the hospitals empty when these people went there?
You saw it on YouTube. We saw it in real life.
We saw it from you. We heard your version. No offense, we don't trust you guys.
And then Marjorie Taylor Greene, who will be elected this fall in Georgia.
businesswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is now the heavy favorite to win a seat representing a deeply conservative district in northwest Georgia. Greene has repeatedly praised the QAnon theory.
Q is a patriot. We know that for sure, but we do not know who Q is. People believe that Q is someone very close to President Trump.
The movement sprung to life in early 2017, based on a belief that there is a high-level government official, Q, who sprinkles clues on internet message boards about a series of massive deep state conspiracies at work in the country.
And this is something she wrote in 2018. And first of all, she was sort of replying to somebody, truth, trust the plan, WWG1WGA, which stands for where we go one, we go all, which is a Q phrase that was popularized, in fact, by the comedian and actor Roseanne Barr. And then you see what she wrote in 2018. The level of importance of this operation equates to a good and versus evil battle that transcends politics. This is a global evil that attempted to take over America. Many in our government actively worship Satan, Moloch, Molech, and participate in pedophilia, spirit cooking, etc. And then she said Saudi Arabia, Rothschild, and Soros are the puppet masters that fund this global evil.
You said George Soros is the piece of crap that turned in, he's a Jew, he turned his own people over to the Nazis. People would say that's anti-Semitic.
Turning over people over to Nazis where they were burned in ovens is anti-Semitic?
No, talking about George Soros being a Jew, comparing him to Nazis.
I'm sorry, anybody that turns over their own people to be burned in ovens, I would definitely say is a horrible person.
Are you saying George Soros is turning over his own people to be burned in ovens? I don't understand.
Listen, I'm not going to play the twist the words game with you.
That's not a twist the words. I don't understand. I would like you to explain it.
Well, no, you clearly are trying to twist words with me, and
I'm reading your own statement back to you, ma'am.
But here's the truth about George Soros from the Washington Post. He was a 14-year-old Jew who hid from the Nazis. He turned 14 in the year 1945. This should be very sobering. Look at these numbers. Half of Donald Trump supporters think top Democrats are involved in child sex trafficking, which is a major point of QAnon. And then do you believe that President Trump is working to dismantle an elite child sex trafficking ring involving top Democrats? 52% of Republicans said yes, 24% of registered voters. Now, Facebook has been trying to push back, but they were very late in pushing back. They keep coming up with new techniques to circumvent what Facebook is doing. You have Colorado trying to put up Google ads that deal with relevant search terms, dealing with misinformation, working with Facebook. California and Ohio trying to do that, but some states are just fighting a rearguard battle, and this is what we are facing. And one final point before I kick it all to you. This is Anthony Fauci receiving death threats, and the president, in fact, going after Fauci. So here we are in a situation where our top scientists are being attacked, where conspiracies are running amok, where social media, even if it was well intended to stop it, though you can't always say social media companies are so well intended to stop it, that they have been, that the conspiracies and other misstatements are circumventing and getting around all of the walls on here. This troubles me. Does it trouble you about your democracy and where we are heading in the future? Okay, so I see a bunch of you with your hands up. Chloe, you're our gatekeeper here, so I'm going to go from my top left down. So I see Jenna, Ryan, Chloe, Riddy, Manuel, Dan, Jeff, and Amrutha.
Yeah, so I just think this overall just speaks to a lack of media literacy and comprehension of just how deep and wide the internet actually is, because I think we often forget that even though we're living in a social media age, that this is still new and it's still developing, and nothing like this has ever been a part of a society, a political election, anything like this. This is all new. So we're still learning how to cope with this social media platform and how it's actively affecting our society. And it keeps advancing every day, every year, so then we're constantly having to readapt to it. And I think what's happening is as that's adapting, as things are spreading and getting deeper into our society, there's just a huge lack of media literacy among our population, of knowing when and how to fact check your sources, getting multiple sources for your information, not just staying within a media bubble of stations and platforms that you like and agree with, but actively searching for opinions that differ from you, that offer different perspectives, so that you can get a comprehensive grasp as to what is actively going on, so you can make informed decisions and opinions. I just think that, especially with deep conspiracy theories, they're enticing, and people just, like I said, have a lack of media literacy, and that just contributes to them believing these conspiracy theories, and then it's just a snowball. Because I know if you read like murder mysteries or watch shows like that, where it's like it goes deeper and deeper, things are spreading, everything's connected, it starts looking like a murder board. And I don't think that they realize that that's not really what's happening. It's like we're not in 1984. And then when you try to then set up gate channels that actively try to prevent disinformation that can be harmful to people and our societies, like Facebook is now attempting to do, then you get the claim that, oh, your big brother's watching you. You're trying to control me. You're trying to monitor me and make me only look at this one thing, and that's not democracy, it's controlling, and then that just feeds into the conspiracy theories. So I think all of this just needs more media literacy. Like, people need to understand from a younger age how to safely navigate the ever-evolving internet, and fully being able to understand how what you see on the internet might not always be true, but it might not always be false as well. And I think we need to learn that from a younger age, now that social media has been actively ingrained into our society and it's not really going to go anywhere. We just really need to learn how to actively adapt to social media platforms that are always changing and evolving, and actively learning how to fact check. Because I think, as I was saying, it's just a lack of media literacy. Because for us, I know as you were presenting, a lot of us were just shaking our heads, and we were just like, this, like, you sound crazy. But to them, it's not crazy, that's factual truth. And it's because they stay within their own media bubbles that they get so ingrained into these conspiracy theories and disinformation, and then they're spreading it on their social media, is what's causing these problems that we're seeing on these internet platforms.
So I agree 100%. In fact, I wrote an essay about 15 years ago saying we absolutely need to have media literacy, though the media literacy that I would have promoted 15 years ago has no relevance to what we have today because of the viral spread of just about everything on social media. But here's the thing, let's say Facebook were well-intended, and one can argue that no, they're just there to monetize whatever they can, and their algorithms reinforce some of these conspiracies and biases. But let's say Facebook were completely well-attended. Even they can't keep up with some of the stuff that goes around. And then here's the other thing. We have people in this country who take math courses throughout high school, but millions are mathematically close to illiterate in terms of how they can run their life. So even if you get 50% of the country that might end up having some of the tools to catch up with yesterday's social media, even if they're not fully prepared to catch up with some of the stuff tomorrow, you still may have 50% of the country that may believe some of this stuff because they're not even empowered with any of these tools to be able to do this. Now, this isn't to say that social media can't do good. I think there's a lot of fact-checking, and the enormous amount of information and access to material that's valid and good is incredible on social media. But the problem isn't that it's good. The problem is the bad stuff on all of this. So again, I agree with you. I'm not so sure how to get out of it, and that's the big question. How do you get out of it? How do you rescue our democracy from stuff where only a few years ago a conspiracy that didn't exist led somebody to go and attack a pizza parlor in Northwest DC and potentially cause violence at that particular point because he was convinced that there was a child sex trafficking ring in the basement of Comet Pizza on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. How do you stop that stuff from going widespread, even when you have somebody who's going to be a member of Congress who subscribes to this? This is where I think you all have to reckon with this far more than I do, because this is your democracy that's being ushered in and your future that you've got to be able to play with. So, Ryan, I think you were up next.
Yeah, so I guess just to answer that question, honestly, I don't think there will be a lot that we can do to stop this. I think that we are going to be heading into a pretty, probably a tumultuous decade. I think, the question when we want to talk about, what's led to this rise in, this belief in conspiracy theory isn't so much on, the medium being used, like social media, but more on, why are so many people believing in this? And I think part of that just stems from, we're in this time of a real, global transition, because, this isn't even just, an American phenomenon. This belief in conspiracy theories has, been seen in just different continents across the globe. And I think that it's just this real, cultural, economic, technological, just transition period we're in. And I think that, just looking at, history especially, that is a time when you will see conspiracy theories really flourish, and you will see a lot of, grifters, people trying to make money out of it, also taking effect. And I think that, it'll just be a pretty tumultuous period that we'll probably be heading into.
And of course, we did see conspiracy theories emerge during the Depression in the most horrific form, emerging in Germany with the conspiracy theory promoted by Hitler and the Nazis. But you also saw some of that in America. How many of you are familiar with the radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin? Anyone familiar with him? If you're not, check him out, Coughlin. He was a virulent anti-Semite who had a radio platform, but it was far easier to be able to control the content on things like radio, or at least put standards in place via the Federal Communication Commission, than it is to be able to do this on a platform like Facebook, which celebrates and has made part of its brand free speech. Mark Zuckerberg talks about that all the time. Or even on Reddit, or potentially on Twitter, notwithstanding all the attempts to be able to manage this. So it was easier, 90 years ago to deal with the Father Coughlin on radio, because you put in place laws about certain types of speech and equal time and all the rest. Much, much harder to do that today. So you're right, conspiracy theories have been with us throughout history, and they've caused just enormous harm and enormous damage and loss of lives. And so they're not going away, but they now have a new platform to be able to spread, and to see how quickly this has spread in just 3 years, to where more than half of one political party gives credibility to that. That should at least give people pause right now. So I think, Chloe, you were next, and then you'll tell me who's after you.
So I know we were talking about, and Jenna specifically brought up the idea of media literacy. And while I do think that's important, I also think it's just as important for the media, specifically the news media, to reach people where they are. I think for those who are studying as journalists, and I am one of those people, I think there is a lot of room to criticize where we are right now as journalists and the journalism industry in general. And I know that that's a cyclical thing, where we lose the trust of the American people, they don't support us, and then there's less funding, and then we can't do the work, and then we lose the trust, and then it goes over and over again. But I think there is a sense of, I guess, inaccessibility when it comes to good journalism. I think people don't know where to go. I don't think that the people who are doing good journalism are trying to reach those people as much as they can. But I also don't think that they are given the opportunity to reach those people. So I think I think there is something we can do. Like as individuals, I think we can try to support local journalism as much as possible, especially if you're from a smaller town, because I know that there are small newsrooms that have like 2 people working there right now. And then for those who are studying to be journalists, trying to make it as accessible as possible for people to read your stories and to watch your stories or to hear your stories. I think that's like all we can do right now to combat what's happening and what we saw. Also, as a final note, please make sure everyone knows who believes in the common pizza thing to not call them asking about it, because it's very annoying.
So, you've heard me say this before. There's a distinction between journalism and media. And journalism is only part of the media ecosystem, but so much of media, as we've seen in many of your briefings with the partisan media, a lot of that can be noise, whereas journalism is designed to be this real signal. But if the signal gets smothered by the noise, that's a problem. But we don't want to end the noise. We actually enjoy and buy into this media system. Millions of people go and seek out the noise in the media world rather than seek out the facts and evidence and core argumentation of journalism. And so this is part of the problem, is that journalism then gets thrown into this larger media context, and people trust it less because all they hear generally is the noise, and they assume that good journalism is no different from that noise that they're hearing, and then they tend to trust it less. So because we're blessed with so much media and so many options to discover things and find things, good journalism can sometimes get smothered by that, and therefore lose the credibility for no reason of its own, but it deserves that credibility, but that credibility gets smothered. So it creates this big problem where, we didn't have as much media years ago. Therefore, journalism could be respected because people were focused on good journalism when they read it. Now, good journalism maybe consumes 5 or 10% of people's information each day, if that much, and the rest of it is often noise. So who is after you, Chloe? You can tell me who?
I think really dissects.
Riddy, okay. And who after Riddy?
Manuel, I'll put it in the chat again.
All right, thanks. All right, go for it, Riddy.
So I wanted to talk about what you touched on with social media, and not in terms of the content itself that's put out there, but the social media companies, because I think that it is such a powerful tool. But I think that they don't know how to wield it. They've created something that they can't control, and they're constantly playing catch up, trying to find that balance between preventing misinformation and not censoring people, which makes them subject to a lot of criticism from all directions, no matter what they do. So when they are trying to prevent tweets that say the president has retweeted that have misinformation, his base and his side will say that they're being muffled. Or when they're trying to propagate what he's saying in terms of like shutting down misinformation against him or criticism against him, we have like women in politics saying, well, we face criticism all the time and you haven't done anything to combat this. And I'm not saying that they're wrong, they're completely right. But what social media companies are facing is that they can't do anything right, basically, right now, is what it seems like. And they can't win and can't find a single way to establish how to combat misinformation. And I think like the larger issue to this is that a lot of the misinformation comes from people in power. So when the president is propagating this misinformation, it's even harder to combat and even harder to curb, because with people with such powerful platforms, the responsibility lies with people in power and not just social media companies.
And it's not that all of this is new. As I said, you had that Father Coughlin in the 30s, but you had the rise of talk radio in the 80s and 90s, which had its own subculture, which generated a lot of misinformation too. But it's almost what you're saying is that social media companies have created a Frankenstein and they don't know how to control it and deal with it. But so far, except for a media literacy, I'm not so sure I've heard any ways to be able to address this. And if you can't address it, how do you know that something like Q or Q's cousin isn't going to continue spreading and reaching more people? I mean, Q right now is becoming even more clever. Let me see if I can find this, but they're now talking about children and protecting the children and all of the rest, okay? So they're realizing that some of these companies are trying to go after them, and then they come up with something new. How do you control this? Doesn't this scare you? All right, so I think Manuel was next.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said. These are, there is no perfect way to combat this, because on the one hand, you have to protect freedom of speech, but on the other hand, you have to stop the spread of disinformation. And I definitely think it's the responsibility of tech giants such as Facebook and Twitter and these companies who are avid sources of information for a lot of people to stop disinformation. But what is disinformation? Like, it depends who you ask. Like, for example, when Twitter flags the president's tweet for disinformation, he won't say that it's disinformation. For him, that's the facts, and that's what it is. So I think this ties into the greater conversation of how polarized we are, that facts are no longer facts. They are how you perceive the facts to be. And I think that one of the greater issues with this sort of disinformation is, like, who are these senators, who are these leaders putting in danger when they are spreading their lies and their conspiracy theories? The El Paso shooter was an avid consumer of right-wing media. He went specifically to shoot Latinos and to shoot Mexicans. The Kenosha shooter had bought into the message that Antifa was going to burn the streets to the ground. These words and these conspiracy theories have consequences that have already taken the lives of innocent people. And until our leaders don't realize that, and until they stop putting their personal gain and political gain above the safety and well-being of the public's information, like, we're just gonna see this get worse. Like, this time it was a shooter, the other time it was a shooter. What if it's a bomb? What if someone, like, you don't know who receives this information? You don't know who the president is targeting when he's saying that, oh, the pizzeria in Connecticut Avenue has kids in their dungeon. Like, there are people who are fanatics of the president who have the resources to do actual harm, and they don't realize this.
Well, there is an example of a bomb. Go back to the 1990s and the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed hundreds of people, with sort of a paranoid conspiracist who used a fertilizer bomb to be able to do something. So what you're arguing is it's just not words, it's not free speech. There are consequences because we are a country with lethal weapons in the hands of 100 and some odd million people who can use those lethal weapons if they truly do believe what these conspiracies say, which is that what's going on, let's say, in an unfortunately sort of labeled pizzeria is a threat to children and a threat to our country. And if they believe it, then they are acting patriotically and defending it using the means that they have to do that. So yeah, this stuff is more than just words. It has consequences, not just for our democracy in the abstract, but for the people whose lives may ultimately be affected. I think, Dan, you're next.
So Manuel's point is absolutely 100% true, and I wanted to reemphasize that too. I remember during the Black Lives Matter movement this June, I was in DC downtown peacefully protesting, like the majority of people. And when I went back home to New Jersey, to rural New Jersey, I remember people were like telling me, like, oh my God, DC was on fire. The whole city was burning down. And they weren't just like telling me out of concern, they were trying to tell me that that's what happened. And I was like, actually, it didn't happen. I was there. Like, the city was not on fire. That's just simply not true. And it's sad because people, I don't know, I think everyone in this Zoom, at least I know I have, I've been grown up to told to not believe everything you read, not to believe everything you read online, that conspiracy theories are real. And then these people that have taught me this growing up are now the people buying into things like QAnon, and it's just insane to me. My aunt, she's a very, very smart woman, but she believes in QAnon. And we had a full conversation. And she was like, well, George Soros. I'm like, to be frank, I don't care about George Soros. We were talking about Black Lives Matter. It's like, I don't care about George Soros because there's actual people going through actual issues. And this is just another way to cloud and prevent those issues from being changed. The same exact thing as Trump bringing up Hunter Biden. It's the same thing. It's a method to distract us. It is a method to divide us. It is a method to cloud our judgment and to provide doubt. And once there's doubt, people make bad decisions. And it's really upsetting because things like QAnon and things like mentioning Hunter Biden are one of the many tools that people like Trump use to prevent things from getting done, to prevent change. And then one other thing I wanted to point out is that there is a real sex ring in the United States, sex trafficking ring in the United States that no one really talks about, especially media. I think QAnon has gotten more attention than this, and it's the Epstein sex trafficking ring, who Donald Trump is friends with was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. And there's photo proof. Not that Bill Clinton wasn't on the island, there's photo proof of that too. And it's not to just crucify Trump, it's to actually make change and stop the sex trafficking ring. It's just so upsetting because what QAnon is saying, that there's a sex trafficking ring in the United States, I mean, they're not wrong on that point. They're just really going way too far and claiming Satanists and all these ridiculous things. And it's just upsetting because if you're involved in sex trafficking, you should be prosecuted, just like the royal family of England, who are absolutely involved, you know? And it's because these people are in power, or because these people have connections to these media groups, strong connections to these media groups. I may have done some research with Epstein's blacklist and looked up people and looked up the names, and they own media companies. But it's just so much to unpack, and it's really upsetting because it not only clouds real issues, but it prevents those issues from being taken seriously. It brings the thing like the Epstein sex trafficking ring to the level of QAnon, and people don't believe it because it sounds like QAnon, when it's a real thing based off facts and real life experiences, real life testimonies, eyewitness testimonies, flight logs, and it's...
So you may know this already, but Q has theories about the deep state involving Jeffrey Epstein. So for them, Jeffrey Epstein is part of this big conspiracy that fits into their, whole view of the world, whether it's, the Mueller probe or the situation about forcing people to wear masks, and so on. So Q posts tend to be, in some ways, either vague or incomprehensible, but here's the thing, QAnon believers then go and do what they can to decipher them. So for example, last year, Q posted a photo of an unnamed island chain. Eager to figure out the reasoning behind this post, QAnon adherents tried to prove that the photo must have been taken on Air Force One, and thus Q was traveling with the president. That is the type of stuff that floats around Q. Q posts are known to the faithful. Anyone know what they're called? Breadcrumbs, okay? They're breadcrumbs, and you look at those breadcrumbs, and then those who try to figure out what they mean are called bakers. They're the bakers. They're the ones who figure out what it's all about. So they've got this whole web of conspiracy and self-reinforcing sort of language and culture that even if you do talk about Jeffrey Epstein, guess what? It will fall exactly into their conspiracy theory, and that is part of what conspiracies are about, is they encompass everything into them. Jeff.
Those bakers sound a few cookies short of a pack, but I think people believe in conspiracies in the event that some have turned out to be true, but usually those have some sort of a basis in reality. And I mean, I know this is not a basis in reality to a degree, but like I believe aliens exist. And in May, there was some government thing released that said, there's some object in the sky and we don't know what it is. I believe aliens exist, but there's a line in the sand you have to draw between something that's like fun and harmless, or maybe something that might be true, and this crap that's getting peddled online, which leads me to my other point that I think Mark Zuckerberg is one of the most destructive forces of the 21st century because of the creation of social media. Now, social media, you know, it has all these good things, it connects people, whatever. I see that, but I think it's also a way for conspiracies to spread far greater and far easier than, because you can just be scrolling through Facebook. You don't have to turn on the radio or anything. You can just mindlessly scroll and see this stuff. And, you know, a lot of people believe in these conspiracies, like this Q stuff, because they, you know, probably have this feeling of enemy and disconnect to society. And feel left behind or something, and see this as something new to believe in. And it's, you know, it spreads because it goes unchecked. And, you know, these social media companies now care to check it, but it's too late because they already have these followings. You saw last week Savannah Guthrie mention QAnon to the president, which I think is, I wanted to throw a book at the TV when I saw that, because it's like, why are we giving these organizations, these conspiracies things, a national platform for more people to go out and look at them? You know, I don't know. I get very frustrated when I think of the damage that's being done now and how much easier it is to believe in some of these more destructive conspiracies today.
But I have not yet heard anybody here come up necessarily beyond Jenna with media literacy, a way to deal with this stuff. And again, you all aren't the problem. You all are fact-based. You all seek out evidence. You try to read a variety of things and look at context. But I can't. But you're not the ones that can worry me. It's the vast number of people who take believing in aliens 3 steps beyond, and actually take some of this stuff really seriously as a guiding principle of their lives. Okay, and you know, so far I've heard, yeah, we got problems, but I haven't heard how you guys are going to deal with it as a generation. So I think I see...
Create a time machine, go back in time and stop Mark Zuckerberg from creating Facebook.
Yeah, well, you know, good luck. But if there, you know, if something is there to be created, somebody will create it in one form or fashion. And that's the thing. It depends on how we as a society try to deal with it. So I think I see Rutha, Zach, Amelia, and Maddie B, Simona, and Ryan. Okay, and Chloe, you're telling me who's next, right?
Yeah, that's actually exactly the point I wanted to touch on, was that even before Facebook was created, it wasn't the first social media network. There were other things. There was MySpace. I don't know what the other ones were.
Friendster.
Old, but
yeah, Friendster.
Friendster.
Yeah.
All the other ones, they were still existing. So it was just a matter of time before a huge social media giant came along. And yeah, Mark Zuckerberg has been horrible at handling a lot of these things, but it was just a matter of time before social media blew up in a way that was uncontrollable. And I think we've seen politicians take advantage of the internet and the speed at which it's grown so much from the inception of it. I mean, I think what unfortunately happened to us was with President Obama's campaign in 2008, they were able to utilize the power of the internet for a message of hope and a message of social change. And so we were all naive and believed that that was what the internet could do for politicians. And because nobody regulated the internet, nobody stopped it, when it was growing, the Trump campaign was able to utilize that same power and that same growing power for negative, nefarious purposes. And I think the biggest issue comes down to internet regulation and tech regulation, because there are no rules. The internet is growing faster than people can even keep up with. Mark Zuckerberg has done a horrible job, but he's also unable to control the way that his platform has just grown vastly over the past few years. So I think, yes, it definitely is an issue of media literacy, but it also is an issue of regulation, because these things have grown so far out of control that it's impossible to really keep a handle on them.
So just a quick question. If you do regulate, and personally I would support that, but you got to be careful how you do it, how do you deal with the issues of free speech?
I think that's where it gets tricky. I remember Elizabeth Warren and I believe Andrew Yang both had plans as well to talk about, I know one of Andrew Yang's plans was owning your own data, so you can have a handle on what companies know about you. I know Elizabeth Warren, she's very far left, so she wanted to deprivatize a lot of these social media companies. So I think that it gets tricky, but I think the main issue is when it leads to violence or it leads to issues that is not guaranteed under free speech. So I think that, it definitely is a little bit of a slippery slope, but I think letting it go on the way it has become uncontrollable.
Yeah, and with all the disinformation on COVID out there, it not only has an effect on people's lives at pizzerias, but in real lives in terms of hospital wards and families and first responders dealing with the consequences of some of this misinformation, and even store clerks who are being faced with people who refuse to wear masks and potentially infecting others. Yeah, this stuff does have real life consequences. So I think Amelia, Zach and then Amelia.
Yeah, I think that this conversation is making me think a lot of when I was watching The Social Dilemma. And the part that really hit me was when they mentioned that there's only two industries that call people who utilize it users, and that's illegal drugs and social media companies. And that to me was something that was really impactful, because I was thinking about the fact that ultimately social media, it does, yes, come down to how much we're using it and how much we're utilizing it for certain, activities. But what I think is the main thing that we can do to change it is to realize that the business model is what is mainly causing all of this unethical activities that are happening with social media companies. I think it's a little strange that we haven't collectively, seen the harms that have come out of social media and demanded, as people who are using it, better terms and conditions for us as users. It simply would take everyone deleting their social media for these social media companies to really feel the impact, because what we know is what drives the algorithms, what drives all these ad buy policies are literally just our attention. And so I think that generationally, as we start to become a little bit more empowered in what is, my dog's barking. As we become a little bit more empowered about what exactly is driving the social media industry in big tech, I think that we will hopefully create a better set of ethics around how we use these things and are treated while using them. Because at this point, social media is really all driven by our inability to disconnect. And so I'm just wondering what will happen when we all really get together and are like, we're not going to get treated like this anymore. I don't know.
So, there's this generational thing where, but I think there's a fake narrative that the older generation always looks down on the younger generation and says, oh, you can't stay away from your phone because everybody does it. It doesn't matter how old you are. People are constantly on their phone, even when they're at dinner with each other or congregating in social environments. Many people are looking at their phone, which is a sign of addictive behavior. How many of you know people who actually check their phones in the middle of the night? Yeah, probably a few of you know people who do that. How many of you have shut off your notifications? Yeah, because notifications are sort of feed that sense of being a user on a constant basis, which means they're designed to, it's a stimulus response. You see it, you feel you have to respond to it. You see it, you feel you have to respond to it. So there are ways to be able to sort of shield yourself from some of this. Now, I'm just watching the chat, and Andriana said you once texted somebody while you were asleep. Is that true? No, you're joking, right?
No, I kind of woke up and I remember my phone went off, so I replied and then I went back to sleep. But when I woke up, I couldn't remember what I'd sent because I was kind of still asleep. So I had to check to make sure I'd actually sent something coherent and not embarrassing. So That was like last week.
So again, when you realize that behavior and how that sort of Skinnerian, behavioral response to all of these stimuli that we have, and then you put it in people who feel vulnerable in life and look for a sort of a fabric that helps them explain this world, then you see how some of this addictive behavior, as Zach says, the users, turns into people seeking that sense of a life narrative through some of these conspiracy theories or bias confirming sites that they gravitate to all the time. And it becomes this, what Bettelheim called a total institution, where we're surrounded by it, we don't get out of it, but that has serious consequences for a democracy that, again, as I always say, depends on informed consent. This is not informed consent. This is where I personally do worry. So Amelia, take it from here, and then I think we have Maddie, Simona, and Ryan.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about Jenna's point about media literacy, and I think even for people who are quite media literate, like these conspiracies, all of the misinformation floating around on social media, which we still use so much, like still sow seeds of doubt in our trust in what we read and also our democracy. Like our age group spends so much time on social media, and like I would probably bet that like you guys also, there's a lot of activism and infographics and so forth on social media, and I think it can be really easy to either absorb it or to feel the need to question it in a way that maybe we hadn't in the past.
Well, and you're right, but there's a lot of creative stuff on social media. That's the thing. You don't want to lose that side, but how do you defend yourself from all the other stuff? And I think that's really the big question right here. So I think Maddie, and then Simona, and then Ryan.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention how misinformation is so, and fear about misinformation in the public is so inherent in a democratic system. I mean, it goes back to Plato in Gorgias wrote about had Socrates being like, oh, oratory, just speeches are immoral because they can convince a public of something that's not true. So I think that this is not necessarily a new problem we're facing, but what we're facing with social media are a couple different things that make it challenging. I would assume this also probably happened when radio became popular, television became popular, books, the printing press was invented. It's going to be somewhat of a cycle, but I think the specific things that make social media challenging are how fast moving it is, how widespread it is, and how there's no barrier to access. That lack of a barrier to access really prevents sort of a stoppage of that intense misinformation at the level, which I think is why we're seeing so much of it now. I don't really have a solution to this, except I think that at some level it's going to take regulation, and I think it's going to take a movement forward, and it might take a good long while for something to happen.
Yeah, you're right that with radio, it may have happened early on. Anyone remember that from history books, the War of the Worlds radio show in the 1930s, where people were getting in their cars and leaving their homes, and because of this sort of fictional science fiction radio show that showed in the 1930s. But the problem right now, as you say, is the speed by which this happens, the access we all have to it, and the inability to put barriers up to bad information because it's spreading faster. Even if you put barriers up, this stuff is already out there and being shared and being sent to other sites if they know that barriers are coming up. And that's the problem. There's no way to stop this spread, and therefore, how do you defend democracy in the process? Simona, and then Ryan.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to, I think it was Jenna's point about media literacy and just kind of like brainstorming through solutions, even though there isn't like one specific solution. I think it's definitely going to have to be a combination of different things if we're ever going to solve or come up with a solution to this thing. But I think we also have to look at media responsibility very seriously, because I think Jeff mentioned this earlier, when we give such a national platform to these like fringe conspiracy theories, it does have real effect and real impact on real lives. And it's a very fine balance between, yes, that people do have a right to know about these, even the fringe conspiracies, and especially when there are public figures running on these conspiracy theories, and I mean, especially when the president in a self-talk status. So yes, we do have a responsibility to cover it, but at the same time,
it is just like giving the movement more momentum. So it's a very like fine balance. And again, I don't have the answer to it, but I think we're definitely gonna have to play around with it and just like figure something out in terms of media responsibility.
So let me ask you, those clips that I showed earlier of QAnon and Marjorie Taylor Greene and so on, does that add to the problem, or because it exposes it? I mean, is it good because it exposes it, or does covering it add to the problem?
I was thinking the same thing when you were showing it, and that's kind of when I thought about this. And I don't know. I think to some point, they were kind of explanatory clips, so it just kind of explained who Q is and what's going on. But I think, and I don't think the media has necessarily been guilty of this with QAnon. I think with other conspiracy theories and other things they have. But the QAnon, I don't think has been as intense because there was kind of like a peak when it happened and when it was mentioned by the president and when that happened. But since then, it's not necessarily died off, but it just hasn't been replaying in the media. But to directly answer your question, I don't know. I think it could have done both.
So this is a dilemma years ago when television was trying to address issues related to negative advertising. If you try and fact check it and you show the negative ad, you're actually reinforcing that negative ad and the message in it rather than necessarily rebutting it. There is a classic case of how this stuff works back in 1984, and some people in my classes may remember this from previous classes. And if you remind me, I'll try and dig it up and play it next Wednesday. But Leslie Stahl, who is now in the news again with 60 Minutes, did a report on the Reagan campaign in 1984, basically saying this is what the Reagan campaign is all about. They use the president's personality and they set up photo opportunities to be able to negate bad policies. So if Reagan talks about cutting the corporate income tax and that's unpopular, they send him to a pub to go drink with sort of the working folks. If he's called to cut money for disabled services and that's unpopular, they sent him to launch the Special Olympics. If he's called for cutting money to senior citizens housing and that's unpopular, they sent him to cut a ribbon at a new senior citizen housing project, basically arguing that what they use are visuals to be able to overcome bad news because the eye is far more powerful than the ear. And after Leslie Stahl aired this, she got a phone call from the White House and she was expecting criticism and hostility. And what did she get? They said, "Great story, Leslie." And she goes, "What do you mean? I just, uncovered the president's strategy here. How can that be a good story?" And they say, "You don't get it. To be able to do this story, you had to show everything that we put up as those visuals. And in the battle between the eye and the ear, the eye will win every time." She went to the CBS execs and said, "This is what the White House told me. I can't believe it." They actually tested that out, and after seeing that story, people were more favorable to Ronald Reagan afterwards than they were beforehand because they kept seeing all of those images. So how you deal with this stuff, that really is a challenge. And I don't think the media have fully figured out how to address all of this. I think Ryan was up, and then Zach, and then I just want to get to one other quick point.
Yeah, so I think just, answering the question on what media coverage will do to this, I think that there is the chance that it really does a harm, like the, especially the QAnon conspiracy theory. I think there is also something social media companies can do. We saw that after the Charlottesville, we saw basically the just intense spotlight that got placed on a lot of sort of alt-right groups. You did see things like them getting deplatformed. A lot of companies no longer willing to post them on the web, which did really do a huge number on their ability to recruit and do those host those events again. You also saw things like ISIS recruitment, this ability of social media companies to really target and stop them from recruiting and pushing out this extremist content. So I do think, want to say though, I do agree with Zach. I think that this is really going to be a big showdown that'll come about like how like legislators, people like, you know, want to basically live with these social media companies, but I do think there is still like items on the table that they can do in the time between.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some of the companies have done some things and it's made it more difficult, but they always seem to find workarounds and set up their other more private or sort of on other sites they've been able to find ways to communicate. So yeah, I do think that companies can do that. It has sort of suppressed it a bit, but I'm not so sure they're going to be successful the next time. And it's always a constant game of chess. And when you look at what, let's say, the Russians may want to do, which is 3 steps ahead to create that chaos in our democracy, that's, they are thinking those things. And trust me, as Anya said earlier, they are not the only ones thinking about these things. Lots of other people are thinking these things as well. Zach, did you want to do the closing comment on this?
I would think that the only thing that really, I think that people are looking for in this throughout this situation really is kind of accountability. I think that what people have been saying, the biggest issue that comes up when we think about this conversation is the fact that people have been saying for years, okay, there are people who are being targeted on social media sites. We're allowing hate to proliferate on social media sites, and that's having negative impact. And what I think the biggest eye-opener is that, when you look at documentaries like The Social Dilemma, when you look at like the people, the voices you lean on to be the voice of big tech, there is an issue with the fact that it is not a diverse industry. That the gatekeepers, like so many other industries, are white men who are able to engineer and craft entire information systems that everyone has to rely on. And so there's these built-in inequalities that are hard for people to shake. So there's an issue with the creation of the systems themselves. And then on the other side of it, it's kind of it's kind of hard to not think that, the things that are happening with the alt-right, all the things that have happened with all the fringe groups that have gotten so much traction to the point now where they're in the mainstream, it's like it's hard not to think that social media companies can just walk past that and not feel like they have some sense of accountability. Because what we know now is that algorithms are not just like things that operate outside of any context. Algorithms can help people who, for instance, might have leaned towards some of the ideologies that Trump or people support, and they help them expose them more and more to the content that helps radicalize people like the shooter in Kenosha or the one in El Paso, Texas last year. These are people who are already vulnerable to the information systems that they're using, and they become even more radicalized and even more violent. And so I think it's like one of those issues that, for me, it's a big human rights crisis that I think social media companies are realizing they have played a part in aiding, and they have some serious accountability that they have to take in mending. That's my last point.
It would be nice to see if social media companies would create or add to their board people of all walks of life and backgrounds, because it's not only your gender or ethnicity, but if you have wealth, you can be insulated from a lot of this stuff. Look at what happened with COVID and all of these billionaires going off onto their yachts on their own. So you can be insulated. The trick is to bring people in whose lives may be affected by this stuff in terms of the decision making, and I don't think that that's been done yet, and it hasn't been done on a lot of companies. So you look at some other countries, and they actually do include, let's say, workers and community members on the boards of their corporations. We just haven't gotten to that space yet. So we're almost out of time. I just want to bring one other thing up, and this, I'll try and just sort of show it to you and sort of give you a little bit of sense of what I'm thinking, because we've covered voter suppression a little bit, and we can always get back to that. But I do want to just mention this. Election law expert Rick Hazen said there are 3 possible scenarios on November 4th, the day after the election, or on days soon thereafter. A narrow Trump victory in the Electoral College with a huge loss in the popular vote, a Biden landslide in which Trump claims he lost because of a rigged election, a very close and potentially flawed election going into overtime that could lead to a prolonged struggle over the presidency and the country. Each of these presents its own set of challenges for American democracy. I think it's the third one that fascinates me, and I just want to run this by you and give it food for thought. So this is where the president has been spending money on his advertising, and look at this. Georgia is the one state where he is really outspending Joe Biden, okay? Really close in North Carolina, fairly close in Arizona and in Nevada, and in Ohio, pretty much equal to Joe Biden, and in Minnesota too. Now, why is that interesting? And let me show you this. And so these are some of the ads that he's putting forth in places like Georgia via Facebook about mail-in balloting and requesting a vote. Here is where mail-in ballots can start getting processed in presidential battlegrounds. Look at that thing on the left. Arizona, Georgia, Minnesota, North Carolina, Nevada, and match that up with the states that he is pouring a lot of money into. And then also Florida, Ohio, Texas, where they start processing beforehand. And then here's this thing which I find quite interesting. Pre-process upon receipt and then counting. Look at the state of Georgia, the first state to process upon receipt, and then the first, one of the first states to start counting and tabulating that on Election Day. Minnesota, Nevada starts tabulating way before Election Day, Arizona. So why is all of this important? It's very important for one reason, and one reason only, which is that the president does not want to be seen as having lost Georgia on election night. Because if he loses Georgia, it will become very hard for him to make any claim that he has won this election, even if he claims that the election was rigged. He is putting his money into the states that may ultimately tabulate their votes and come to some conclusions on election night. And if he can hold on to some of those key battleground states on election night, and then you go back and you look at this thing, and I'll just share it again. Look who tabulates late, okay? Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and some of these states continue to accept ballots later on. What can he say? He can basically argue that all of that counting in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that are later on, which appears to be states that Joe Biden might be able to win and pull off and win this presidency, but we may not know that for days later, he can pretty much argue that he has come close and may well be victorious on election night. So when I'm thinking through his strategy right now, I'm thinking that very possibly he is gaming out how to play election night and the perceptions of people. It doesn't mean that he's not going to transfer power peacefully. What it may mean is that he simply wants to say that the election was rigged and he'll give up power, but he never really lost because he doesn't want to see himself as a loser. But in politics, follow the money. Because if you follow the money, he does not want to lose Georgia. If he loses Georgia election night, he will not be able to make any claim that the election was rigged and that he has a claim to victory in any way, shape, or form. Same with North Carolina, and same with Arizona and some of those early states. Keep your eye on Georgia early on, because he wants to be able to not lose that, because if he loses it, this election is over early. If he keeps that, keeps some of his other battleground states that report early where he's pouring money into, then he can make the argument that all of these absentee ballots and mail-in ballots in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are rigged. There's fraud. He can bring it to court. He can litigate his way around this because he will have a foundation of states where he's poured money into for election night. So now you see the scenario that's potentially gaming out and how sophisticated all of this is. So I'm going to give you like 3 comments if any of you wants to say anything right now, and then we're going to close up for the day. Does any of this stuff concern you for election night and thereafter? And I see the first 2 people are Andriana and Amrutha, and then Andrea, and you guys will get the last word.
Does this stuff concern me? Yeah, I think it should concern everybody. I think
we should just expect right now for Donald Trump to contest the election and say, if he loses any states on election night, if we don't find out for a few more days, that he's going to say that it's rigged or that it's fraud and it's against him. I wish we saw more news organizations, more social media organizations, more politicians kind of taking a stand against this and saying, like, we're not going to support, or we're not going to proclaim who's the winner until we have this, and this. We don't really see that. We see Twitter and Facebook taking some steps to moderate early claims to victory. We know who that's going to be from. But it's not a lot. And so I'm really worried. We were just talking about disinformation and how rapidly it spreads and how easily it can become a conspiracy theory. And I think that'll play into a huge role when Trump claims that he won early. And I think he definitely will. So, and again, I think I mentioned this in a different class, but I'm not only concerned about Trump saying that he won early. I'm concerned about Fox News backing him up, and I'm concerned about Republican officials, GOP congressmen and women and senators backing him up. And despite the fact that they might not know, they just want to create confusion that might lead to Trump's victory in the Supreme Court. I think there's so many different, and we can like speculate and speculate and speculate. There's so many different circumstances where chaos can reign. But the bottom line is there's a lot of cause for concern, and I wish people of power were taking larger steps to try to mitigate that risk.
And it doesn't even have to be just Fox News. You just look at the vote tally on CNN or CBS or MSNBC or ABC or whatever. The vote tally itself is the raw numbers, again, may not reflect anything, but they will continue to fuel that narrative that you'll hear in other universes, even if those networks themselves, even if Fox is responsible on all of this. This is part of the problem, is that they're not the only sources anymore, but those raw numbers are numbers that will help fuel this narrative everywhere else. So this is where it gets sort of fascinating. So I think, who was next? Was it Amrutha?
I'm switching with Amrutha, and I'm going first.
Okay.
I wanted to say that I think it's concerning, and it's not only concerning for the state of democracy now and what happens this year after November 4th, but what happens in the decades to come for the United States and what these implications can mean for what our democratic process is and how the Electoral College should be changed. This is something that especially young people have been talking about for a while now and have wanted it to occur, and this could possibly be good for change in the Electoral College, but at the same time, if we face this backlash of Trump claiming an early victory and news sources supporting that and the chaos, it might get lost in the chaos. And I find that a lot of times progress has been lost in this chaos. We don't see as much occurring as we want because there is so much small nitty-gritty that we have now to pick about Trump because there's just so many issues. And so I'm just as worried, I would say, about what happens on November 4th through January 20th, his inauguration, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I am just as concerned about that time period as I am, from January 20th, 2021 until at what point does America realize that it needs to change and there needs to be greater progress in how we vote, in the voice that an individual can carry, how much power do individual votes have, and what are the not only individual votes but like oppressed groups or people who aren't being viewed as positively, let's say, in the eyes of the current administration. And I think that that's just as damaging to our country. And yeah, I think that if this last scenario were to occur, it's going to have greater implications than just who becomes president, who is inaugurated.
in January, I think it has implications as to the state of American democracy going forward.
And I would argue that it's not just climate change that's an existential threat to your generation, it's the health of our democratic institutions as revealed and discussed in our conversation here. Ruthie, you get the last word.
I'll try to keep it brief because I know we're over time here, but I think my biggest concern heading into election night is how it's going to be covered by the news media. You know, we're all used to gathering around the TV, watching on election night as the votes come in, and Wolf Blitzer saying we're now calling this state for this candidate, and that's great, but I really hope that as soon as we go into election night, they don't try to put on some spectacle to make people think that we're going to know who it is that night. And I think they have a huge responsibility to the people of this country to drive home the point that we are not going to know who the president is that night. And I think if they can do that responsibly, then they will completely take away Trump's strategy of trying to target the states that tab votes early. Because if people think we're going to find out that night and the news media lets them think that, then we're going to have a serious hard time counting the 45 million people and counting who have already voted.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the media have a responsibility to do exactly what you're saying. The only caveat I would put forth is that that one state of Georgia, if somehow Georgia flips over to Joe Biden, that becomes maybe not a tipping point state in the election, though I think it would be very hard for the president to win re-election without Georgia. But I do think it becomes a tipping point state on election night. But beyond that, I think you're 100% right. We have to be primed not to expect that we will know who the president is, possibly for a week after that, if not more. And I can't remember which state it was, but it goes all the way to like November 23rd or something, where they have to have all of their votes counted and put in place. So we could be waiting, in fact, a couple of weeks to be able to find out. How we react to this will be a sign of how strong some of the fabric of our democracy is at this point in time. Any case, you all have been great. I really appreciate your time and thoughts and insights. I hope I didn't depress you too much on the health of democracy, but I do think that your generation needs to take that torch and find a way to be able to deal with those problems, because what we're seeing right now is just the beginning, and if we don't begin to address them now, then I do worry that that Frankenstein monster can become unmanageable, and you know, we all lose the birthright that's been given to us by prior generations, even if imperfectly and not wholly adequately. In any case, folks, rest up. We got an interesting couple weeks ahead. For those WSA viewers, we're going to be putting together our Electoral College map predictions next week. In any case, thank you all, and I will see you all very soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.